If you ever studied the history of U.S. relations with Latin America during high school or college, you most likely learned that the U.S. often treated Latin America like its own backyard. It didn't directly rule over these colonies compared to European nations, but it did use tactics of exploitation and intervention to dominate over them nonetheless. And if you've ever studied U.S. relations with Latin America during the Cold War, you most likely learned that the U.S. continued secretly intervening and exploiting Latin American countries in the name of preventing the spread of communism. But with all that being said, did all Latin American countries have this exact relationship with the US? When I began researching US Mexican relations during the mid 20th century, I learned that the US and Mexican governments became good friends with one another while also developing close economic ties. But how did this relationship come to be? After all, the 19th and early 20th centuries saw some big bumps in their relationship, to say the least. Furthermore, just because the US was friends with a Latin American government doesn't mean that the US was allied with the people of that country. During the Cold War, the US was allied with the Guatemalan government, and yet that government was made up of ruling elite planters. And when the Guatemalan people elected a president that sought major reforms, the CIA backed a 1954 coup so that the elites could return to power. So, how was America's relationship with Mexico different from that of other countries? Well, the answer to those two questions is more complex than a black and white answer. In regards to the latter, the Mexican government did a lot of things during the Cold War that would definitely be counted as autocratic. But at the same time, it also introduced a period of economic prosperity, which allowed for a growing middle class and a bustling car industry that still remains strong to this day. I will cover that more later on, but right now we will start with the first question. Why did the US and Mexico become friendly? I'm Paul Telchon, and this is the history of US Mexican relations in the mid 20th century. As mentioned before, the US and Mexico were not the best of friends during the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the years between 1845 and 1853, Mexico essentially lost a third of its entire territory to the US, mainly as a result of the Mexican American War that had been so disastrous for Mexico. Losing these lands also meant losing the immense natural resources on those lands to the US. By 1900, the mineral output that the US gained from those lost lands alone amounted to more than the national income of the Mexican Republic itself. So, as you can imagine, Mexico was very bitter about that. During the mid 1870s, a man by the name of Porfirio Diaz became the president of Mexico by overthrowing his predecessor. In 1878, Diaz and the U.S. worked out the deal in which the U.S. would diplomatically recognize his government, and in return, he would grant generous concessions to U.S. investors wishing to expand their interests into Mexico. And expand they did. By 1911, 7 of the largest businesses in Mexico were either owned jointly or outright by U.S. interests. The U.S. also controlled nearly 38% of all the aggregate foreign investment in Mexico, mostly in railroads, mining, and real estate. Thanks to this foreign investment from countries like the U.S., Mexico's economy modernized. Railroads boomed, oil wells sprung up, and docks were constructed. It was all good until an economic depression hit in 1907. After that, many Mexican investors simply couldn't compete with foreign investors from the U.S. Because the Mexican people were no longer benefiting from this modernization, they blamed Diaz, who was still president after 7 terms. This is what resulted in the Mexican Revolution in 1910. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about the Mexican Revolution because it's just too important of an event to cover in just this one video. As of now, just know that it led to the overthrow of Diaz and resulted in a sequence of armed struggles over topics such as land redistribution, peasant empowerment, anti-clericalism, and so on. Oh, and the revolution saw the rise of anti-American sentiment in Mexico, so that's important. By the 1930s, diplomatic relations had normalized between the two countries, but things were still tense. In 1938, for example, Mexico had expropriated all of its oil under a nationalized company known as Petróleos Mexicanos, or Pemex for short. U.S. oil companies who had their Mexican oil taken from them responded by boycotting Pemex. But although it looked like these two would never become friends again, one event was about to change all of that: the rise of fascism in Europe. The Mexican president at the time, Lázaro Cárdenas, and the U.S. president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, both realized that the U.S. and Mexico would need to work more closely together, both economically and militarily, in case of a fascist attack. Therefore, leaders from both countries made serious efforts to improve their relations. A transcribed conversation from June of 1940 between U.S. Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles and the Mexican ambassador shows us just how much relations had improved by then. The ambassador said that the U.S. could count on full Mexican military and naval cooperation in the case of fascist aggression, and even said that U.S. forces could use Mexican territory and naval bases during such a war. All of this shows that both countries were entirely favorable of entering into a military alliance, something that seemed unimaginable a decade ago. And in June of 1942, Mexico finally declared war on the Axis powers after German U-boats sank two Mexican oil tankers and refused to apologize. At that point, Mexico and the U.S. experienced an unprecedented degree of economic integration. In order for the Americans to keep building weapons, planes, and ships for the war, Mexico sold to them strategic resources that they needed, such as zinc, lead, copper, and graphite. However, there was one resource that Mexico had that the U.S. needed a lot of. It powered tanks, planes, automobiles, etc. Even today, the U.S. just can't seem to get enough of this resource. And that resource is, you guessed it, oil.
Of course!
As a result, Mexico reopened its oil to the U.S. markets, and in return, the U.S. provided foreign investment and support to Pemex and other Mexican industries that were vital to the war effort. This caused Mexican industrial productivity to boom and for the national income to triple between 1940 and 1945, thus helping to lead into the Mexican economic miracle. One final way in which World War II affected U.S.-Mexican relations was through the Bracero program. As the U.S. had to draft many of its farm workers to fight in the war, a labor shortage developed. Therefore, the U.S. allowed millions of Mexican men to work on its farmland through short-term labor contracts. And despite the fact that the Bracero program was supposed to end along with the war, Bracero contracts continued to be signed until the 1960s, thus providing unemployed Mexican laborers with a steady stream of job opportunities. After the war, the U.S. continued to be a good friend to Mexico by assisting it in various ways. It provided wheat shipments to relieve a Mexican food crisis in 1946. It tried to help stabilize the peso in 1948. It helped to resolve a salinity problem within the Colorado River, and it resolved a border dispute between the two nations by transferring the Chamizal area to Mexico. But even as Mexico was developing close ties with the U.S., it still tried to maintain a degree of independence. This was especially true with its foreign policy, which was based on the principles of non-interventionism and self-determination for all people. For example, Mexico condemned the Bay of Pigs invasion, recognized Fidel Castro's government in Cuba, and denounced the military dictatorship in Chile that overthrew President Allende. Okay, so that's how the two countries developed their close relations. Now we'll cover the relations between the Mexican government and its own people. As mentioned before, the Mexican government throughout most of the 20th century had certain qualities that would make you say, hey, isn't that kind of authoritarian? And more than often, you would be right. First off, from 1929 to 2000, Mexico's government was dominated by a single political party known as the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI for short. Other single parties that have consecutively ruled governments for that long a period of time include the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party. That's not really a list you want to be on. Plus, if I put this video on YouTube now, it'll probably get demonetized. Furthermore, the PRI was no stranger to the traditional art of election rigging. It used various dirty tactics to prevent members of opposition parties from winning elections. Next, while Mexico had no official censorship policy, the PRI government did have close relations with TV executives while also having control over state advertising and newsprint supplies. This meant two things. One, loyal TV producers would generate stories that reinforced the party line. And two, if newspapers published stories that portrayed the PRI in a bad light, the state could then threaten to remove its newsprint supplies and advertisements. However, it's also important to realize that while Mexico's government was always authoritarian during the mid 20th century, by the early 60s it had become more liberal authoritarian. Both the government and the Mexican people began to fear each other less and less over time, which then convinced the government to allow for greater tolerance and greater freedoms. Moreover, the state was often responsive to the needs of at least the majority of the Mexican people. So, as long as the people didn't threaten the state, and the state didn't threaten the people, the two sides could live in greater harmony. But that's just one side of the story. We also need to discuss the state's relationship with Mexico's working class. During the 1940s, the government encouraged companies to pay their workers lower wages in order to encourage greater investment in Mexico's industries. Furious by this injustice, unionized workers organized large-scale strikes which were led by militant communist union leaders. In response, the state used its legal authorities and coercive powers to replace these militant and independent union leaders with a new set of leaders known as charros. Unlike your average leader, charros were very business friendly and more loyal to the Mexican state. Perhaps they were so loyal because the state provided them with bribes. Well, that's just my 2 cents. I imagine the charros would be earning way more money than 2 cents since they were driving luxury cars. However, charros were more than just people who drove luxury cars and talked about 2 cents. Their job was to make sure that union workers didn't pose serious threats to either industry or the government's way of doing things. If union workers were to strike without the permission of charros, or even tried to challenge the authority of charros, they could expect to either be fired or receive a visit from some unfriendly thugs. However, what's important to note here is that these bad things would only happen to workers who challenged the system. Those who remained obedient actually got rewarded quite well. Yes, wages were below what they were supposed to be, but workers were more than compensated later on with production bonuses, a social insurance program, and an increase in generous benefits. Moreover, the costs of living were dramatically decreasing around this time, from an average of 22% annually in the late 40s to less than 5% in the 50s. And by the 60s, union families were able to afford the luxuries of a better quality of life, such as automobiles, TVs, and education for their children. That meant that the next generation would live in even better quality of life than their parents. However, there was one event that the PRI is most notoriously known for, and that is the massacre of student protesters in 1968. The thing was is that minor student protests and anti-government sentiment among students had been nothing new over the past 20 years. As long as they didn't actually pose a threat to the government, they were fine. Yet starting in late July of 1968, peaceful student protests were, for some reason, met not by the local police forces, but by granaderos, a special riot force. Rather than calmly dispersing the demonstrations, the granaderos would indiscriminately beat any students they came across. Outraged by such unnecessary violence, the students responded with even larger anti-government demonstrations and even some violence. It all continued to build up until October 2nd, when a large student demonstration in Tlatelolco Square was met by government agents who fired on the students from the rooftops. Those who survived the shooting were arrested and taken away to prisons meant to be hidden from the nation. It was obvious that this was meant to be kept a secret from everyone, but eyewitnesses did make it out, and they exposed the truth to the world. The PRI may have successfully put down the protesters in the end, but its reputation was forever tarnished by what is now officially known as the Tlatelolco Massacre. And breathe. That concludes the end of my video. Hopefully you've all become more educated about the complex relationships Mexico had with its people and with the US. I'm Paul Teljohn. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll be doing more of these videos in the future.